So how can we assign icons here? How can we then also make sure that we use the color we want to use? Let's start with the color before we add the icons. Just like the create stack navigator function, create bottom tab navigator also takes a second argument. First argument is your configuration object where you configure the different tabs and the screens they point at. Second argument is also an object where you can configure the navigator in general. There you have a couple of settings. Again, official docs are the place to go to learn about every single setting here. One of the more important settings here are the tab bar options. This is another object, and in there you can in detail control how the tab bar appears, how it's styled. You can set up an inactive tint color, which is the color the tab has, which is currently, well, not active. You can set up an active tint color, and that's what we actually need here. You can set up an active background color and an inactive background color as well, of course, to also change the background of the tabs here if you want to. And therefore, you have a lot of possibilities to really fine-tune this to your requirements. And here I'll set an active tint color because that's all I need here. But of course, feel free to play around with that and change background colors as well and change other settings. And I'll set my active tint color to a value from my colors constant, which I import here. I'll set it to colors accent color. We haven't used it before, but now I'll use it. And that's this orange color, which we now have therefore. And this is how easy we change the color the active tab has. Now that's one thing. Please also note that this of course doesn't add an icon. And how would it? We're not saying anything about the icon we want to add. Now for adding the icon, the straightforward pattern, I think, is that you go to your route config here, so to the config where you map screens to your tabs, and you use the longer form where you add the screen property, where you then also add navigation options. By the way, you could also do this directly in the component, of course, by adding navigation options just as we did it before. However, since Meals here actually is a navigator, the only place of adding navigation options to that is of course here, or also here on Create Stack Navigator. There you could also set up a navigation options key here on the second argument on this object you pass as a second argument to Create Stack Navigator, where you configure the overall navigator to give this navigator itself some navigation options. Because the navigation options we assign to the Meals navigator, so to the Stack navigator, are now the options which are taken into account by the Tab navigator, which uses this Meals navigator as a nested navigator. And the navigation options we can set here include a tab bar icon. We can add tab bar icon here, and tab bar icon actually is a function. It's not a single icon you point at, but instead this is a function. It's a function that receives some tab information, you could say. Whoops, should go here. That's the argument we get automatically because this function, of course, will be called by React Navigation. And tab bar icon, this function here, has to return the icon which you want to render for this tab. So in this case, for the Meals tab. That means that I need to be able to use icons here, and for this we can import Ionicons or any other icons that you want to use from @expo vector icons. Again, feel free to install this package. Normally it should be installed automatically when working with the Expo, but you can simply run npm install --save @expos/vector-icons to be sure that you have it installed. And you can use any icons that you want, but I always use Ionicons throughout this course. I'll stick to them. With that, you can use Ionicons as a component, as you learned earlier in the course. So here we can just return Ionicons like this to render an Ionicon icon. And you can now use any icon name you want here. And here I want to use iOS Restaurant, which is simply an icon I found in the list of icons. This list here, which I also showed earlier, there it's this iOS Restaurant icon which I picked, which I now use, which I point at here. This is the icon I want to render. I'll give it a size of 25. You can experiment with that, but I found 25 to look quite decent here in the tab bar. And a color, and that's now important, of tabinfo.tintColor. Because the color we set here, of course, should be our tint color we set up here. Now, of course, we could hard code this to color accent color here, but if we then change it down there, we have to remember that we also change it up there. The good thing is, and that's why this is a function, that React Navigation calls this function for us and gives us some vital information about how our tab bar is configured in that tab info object. And that, for example, includes the tint color we did set up so that we can dynamically retrieve this here for coloring the icon, so that if we change the color down there for the tab bar, it's automatically reflected in our icons up there. So it's a little convenience we have here, which we can use here. So with that, I'm rendering this icon for the meals. And for the favorites, we can now use a similar approach, use that longer form where we set up the screen here, and then add navigation options here, which will be merged with any navigation options we set up on favorites screen. But please note that, of course, you could absolutely also set up the navigation options here in the favorites screen component therefore. But to keep it all in one place, I'll do it in my navigation setup here instead. So these are my navigation options for this screen. Just as for this navigator, the meals navigator, we can of course set up navigation options for a screen. That's what we did throughout the entire module after all. And there I want to do essentially the same, so I'll just copy that, add it here to this navigation options object. And the only thing that differs here is the icon I want to use. Here it's iOS star instead of iOS restaurant. And with that, if we save this, I actually get an error because since I now use JSX in here, we need to import React, of course. That's how React works, because JSX behind the scenes is transformed to React create element, as you know. And therefore now, after adding the React import here in the meals navigator JS file, this works, and now we have icons which automatically take our tint color. And that's how easy you can add icons. Now, besides setting the icon, you might want to set the label as well. And you see that by default, the label, meals and favorites, is simply the identifier we assign here when we set up our tab navigation, meals and favorites. Now, often that makes sense, but in case you want to have a different label, then in the navigation options of your screen, you load here into this tab, you can set up a tab bar label property. And in there, whoops, that is just a string where you could have favorites with an exclamation mark. And if you set this, you'll see that now you have favorites with an exclamation mark here instead of just favorites as before. So you can override this default label, which is assumed, which normally is your identifier. If you want a different one, you can override it. And of course, there are more options you can set, and attached you find a link to the official docs for this navigator, where you can learn all about the options you can set up on the navigator itself, but then also on the navigation options of child screens, so of nested screens or nested navigators inside of the tab navigator. So what we're setting up here.